I'm delighted to be here, a real honor, and I appreciate the wonderful hospitality of Flaminio and his colleagues. I want to talk today about the philosophy of agent-based modeling and then show you really a big range of applications, from toy models that are revealing to hyper high fidelity, global scale, epidemic dynamic models, urban models, all these things, just to demonstrate to you the flexibility and power of the method. My affiliations are several. I'm a professor of epidemiology, although my PhD is in political science. I'm director of the NYU Agent-Based Modeling Lab. I'm proud to say that Flaminio is a member of our lab, so by extension you all are, I suppose. And I have several affiliations at NYU, the Courant Institute for Mathematical Sciences and the Department of Politics, and I'm also a long-standing member of the Santa Fe Institute. So today's talk is about modeling. So I thought I'd start with my favorite quote on this topic. Art is a lie that helps us see the truth. My favorite modeler, Picasso. So just for fun, I'll show you a painting and you tell me what it's a painting of. All right? What is pictured there? You know, maybe I should, maybe kill some lights maybe would be easier. How do I do that? Just turn these down in front. Yeah, perfect, that's nice. Okay, so this is a picture, a painting. It's a painting of a square, right, with people moving around. It's a market, a fair of some sort, agreed? Pretty clear what's happening there. All right? So it's a busy market, a street fair. It's a painting by Pissarro called Fair in Dieppe, painted in 1901. Very clear what's going on at the social level, right? I mean, it's a fair. There's people milling around, going to these stalls.
I have to ask you to speak up.
Oh, sorry. Okay, fine, sure. It's a fair, and it's clear that people are milling around, going to different stalls, enjoying their day at the market, right? So at the social level, it's clear what's going on. Agreed? What about the individual level? At the individual level, are the individuals precise in this painting? I mean, if you look at a close-up of these individuals, they're not at all precise. They're crude gobs of paint, right? And if you zoom in on them, here's some detail. That doesn't look like a person or a person or a person, right? So it's very clear what's going on socially. But the individuals are very crude, primitive blobs of paint. They're only suggestive of the actual individuals, right? And I think this is a big theme in modeling generally. And the painting is actually the cover of my book, Generative Social Science, for this reason, that crude microagents, agents that are very crude at the individual level, but perhaps understandable for that reason, right, can generate clear macro patterns. And just as Picasso would have it, art, the agents, are lies. They're completely distorted blobs in software that help us see the social truth. And honestly, that's my favorite kind of modeling. Dream up individual agent rules that are incredibly simple, but that generate interesting and important social dynamics and reveal the core drivers as simply as possible. But no simpler. Einstein said a model should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. So it really is an art, modeling, but it's also a science, right? I mean, we can calibrate these models to data, and I think it's commendable that the Behave School is trying to really build agent-based models that are informed by empirical work. I mean, I think that's a really huge, important advance, fusing those. And in fact, many journals require us to calibrate these models these days. Of course, Pissarro didn't publish any calibration of his painting to the actual fair in Dieppe. And if art galleries then were like academic journals now, L'Ermitage, where the painting hangs, would have written back in a very high, tone, "Regrettably, Mr. Pissarro, we've reviewed your submission and found it wanting. You will need to include a calibration of your painting to the actual data for the fair in Dieppe. Of particular concern to the reviewers was that the average spacing between individuals, terribly unrealistic in their own right, does not accord with the true spacing. I will reconsider a repainted fair with validated spacing and more realistic people, but as it stands, your painting is rejected. Thank you for your interest in our museum, and best of luck with your impressionistic endeavors. Don't laugh. The Impressionists really were rejected for lack of realism, for lack of calibrated, and it took a long time for them to succeed. So modeling, Impressionism, caricature can reveal without depicting, right? I mean, there's no photograph of actual Jimmy Carter. Looks like this, but there's no mistaking who that is. And in that spirit, we'll talk about my Agent Zero, but I call the runs in that book computational parables in order to enforce the sort of humility with which I, proffer this creature. Now, we've also built lots of very realistic models, which are very useful, and I'll show you those. But as newcomers to the field, one important thing I would say to you is don't be intimidated. There are lots of legitimate goals of modeling, from toy, idealized models to full-scale, high-fidelity models that I'll also show you. So don't be intimidated. Resist silly demands that you predict things and all of this. I think a lot of people see models and they immediately think, well, you must be trying to predict everything, predict stuff. And there's lots of reasons to build models. Other than prediction, and I imagine many of your projects will not claim to be predictive, but they may offer important insight and may just be fun. And those are legitimate goals. I published a paper a while ago in Flaminio's journal called Why Model, which offered 16 reasons other than prediction to build a model. And there are many of them: to explain things, guide data collection, illuminate dynamics, suggest analogies. I mean, if rumors, revolutions, financial panics, if all of those things really are contagious and spread like epidemics, let's see if the existing theory of epidemics informs them, informs their study. Promote a good habit of mind, offer options in crises, a million things to do with models. None of these are predicting, but they're very valuable, and there's a million reasons to build a model. One of them is prediction, of course, and models can predict. But here too, even physics gave up trying to predict individual trajectories in collective phenomena like gases, inventing statistical mechanics. And we can certainly aspire to making statistical predictions in the social sciences, predictions about distributions of wealth, of firm sizes, of cities, patterns of violence or disease. In fact, we've done that. There's a lot of agent-based modeling that has been calibrated to these true events. Infectious disease modeling, it's had a huge impact. So models get a lot of silly criticism because silly goals are imputed to us. I can't predict some person's life trajectory any more than I can predict the life course of a particular squirrel in an ecosystem. But I may develop important overarching laws in ecosystems, the species area scaling law, and can even show these things with methods of statistical mechanics. So you can predict statistically, but it's not always incumbent on you to do so, right? You can say, look, I'm not trying to predict, I'm trying to give an insight or make an exploration or something of this sort. But I think the main distinction that I make, because Flaminio mentioned generative explanation, a crucial distinction is between explaining and predicting, okay? They're totally different enterprises. And I consider most of my work to be explanatory, not predictive. But they're completely different, and it's important to understand why. Predictions are claims that something will happen or when something will happen. And explanations are about why they happen, okay? So let's just think about this for a minute. Why are there earthquakes? Plate tectonics, right? So we can explain earthquakes, why are there earthquakes? Can we predict? No. Why are there tsunamis? Same thing, plate tectonics. Can we predict the next tsunami? No. All right? But there's a common mechanism, right? Who would have imagined that the same mechanism for earthquakes, tsunamis, mountains, plate tectonics is a huge unifying explanatory advance, but it's not a point prediction. It doesn't let us make a point prediction about the next earthquake or tsunami, but it's a deep insight about the mechanism of all of those. So we can aspire to that kind of insight without claiming to predict, you know, on June 7th, the Soviet Union will fall apart, you know. Let's keep playing. So why are there new viruses? I think except in some benighted quarters, people would answer evolution. But we can't even predict next year's flu strain. All right? So again, we might explain through principles of evolution, selection, mutation, and so forth, without claiming to predict the next variant of pandemic flu. Okay? So, we agreed that a model could explain but not predict. Could a model predict but not explain? What do you think? You don't think so? All right. Well, here's an example to think about. Here's data from a famous, the Hudson Bay Company, which was one of the great fur trading and trapping companies of the 19th and even into the 20th century. And this is their data on lynx. Lynx are kind of fox-related cat or something. They're cats, I guess, right? Yes. All right, so here's the data on lynx. And this is, I should have labeled my axes, the cardinal sin, but this is every decade, and this is the, in some number of pelts, right? They delivered pelts to the Hudson Bay Company, and they made clothes out of this lynx pelts. And so they kept good records of these pelts, and they have this data on the lynx population. Okay? It's a time series of lynx, right? And you can predict that time series extremely well with something called an ARMA model, autoregressive moving average model, where you say lynx pelts on day T is a function of yesterday and the day before that and the day before that plus a noise term. And you can fit these equations using orthodox statistics and find that the relevant coefficients are these. So the equation predicts that curve. It generates that curve with very high fidelity. All right? Does it explain the lynx cycles? I mean, is there anything missing?
Does not explain.
Sorry?
It does not explain.
What would help explain? What would explain those cycles better?
Another biology?
Well, other thoughts? Hunting? Hunting is a thought. Yes?
Their food source.
Exactly right. What's missing is the prey. I mean, all you have there is the predator cycle, but the reason it's cycling is that it's part of a predator-prey system, and typically these oscillate. The most famous model of ecosystem dynamics is something called the Lotka-Volterra model, named after Alfred Lotka and Vito Volterra. And they have a predator-prey cycle where L is the lynx and H are the hare. And they're saying that the rate of change of the lynx population is this, and the rate of change of the hare. What's the story? These equations are telling a story. All right? What's the story? The story is that without any hare, the lynx would just die out. All right? And the growth rate in the lynx is a lynx bumps into a hare and chomps them with probability B. All right? So this is growth rate of the lynx comes from eating the hare, and if the hare die out, the lynx decline too. And likewise for the hare, they'd do great without these pesky lynx eating them all the time. They'd just grow exponentially. But because the darn lynx are eating them, their population falls. So there are all these hares, the lynx eat them, the lynx population grows, the hare population falls, but now there's not much food. So the lynx die out. But because they died out, now the hare can grow back. But now that the hare grow back, there's tons of food and the lynx grow back, and it goes around like this in a cycle, okay? And that's all these equations are showing. It's still very crude and assumes perfect mixing of lynx and hares and continuous predators and prey. And you'll enjoy, if you don't encounter it immediately, there's a nice NetLogo model of ecosystems that has wolves and sheep and grass. It's a food chain on a space. And in the continuous Lotka-Volterra model, the differential equations model, predators and prey are infinitely divisible, right? You can't have you can have fractional predators and fractional prey, and they're real variables, not integer valued. So nothing really goes extinct. But here, things can go extinct, and you could learn that if predators eat all the prey, they're doomed. They overfish their fishery and they're out. That's a really important thing to understand, and it's not evident in the predictive lynx ARMA model. I mean, look at all we have. All we had was this thing, and what we really are interested in is the entire system. And when we build an agent-based model of it, we discover an important principle having to do with sustainability and overfishing and so forth. So this is an explanation where the other was merely a prediction. And sometimes that's revealing in a way that a pure prediction is not. Please, sir.
I was wondering how predictive the explanatory model is. And if you wanted to achieve both ends, for example, something that's explanatory and predictive,
Yeah.
would you combine those two aspects? Like
Yeah,
an aspect
sure.
of the predictive model and
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in some cases, models do both. I mean, the predator-prey cycle is from the Lotka-Volterra equations, but there's a lot of statistical work fitting those parameters so that in a particular ecosystem, yeah, you can get a very good sense of what's actually going to happen, and there's seasonal effects and all sorts of other things. So yeah, in some cases, you can certainly do both, but neither is actually implied by the other. Okay? Good question. All right, returning to the discussion of goals then. I think we've agreed that a model could explain but not predict, and that a model could predict but not explain, and that there are lots and lots of different goals you might have. So when you present a model, even in this course, I would say, it can avert bad reviews and disarm impertinent criticisms to state your goals. Think hard about what is the goal of your modeling, Is it to gain a little bit of understanding? Is it to actually predict? Are you comparing it to data? Are you using it to inform policymakers? Are you trying to blow some stupid theory out of the water with it? I mean, what are you trying to do? Is a good thing to think about eventually. I mean, I built a lot of models without knowing what I'm really doing, and then I discovered that, that could do something, and then I pretend to have that as a goal. But yes, think about what your goals are. And I think if Pizarro had written to the curators of the museums and said, "Dear curator, my goal is not photographic depiction," he might have done better getting accepted at museums, all right? Another underappreciated function of models, which I'm actually going to get around and show you some models at some point, is to guide data collection itself. Here again, I think there's a lot of legend about the role of data. And I think, students in the social sciences and elsewhere are often taught, and even scientists, I think, uncritically believe that the scientific method begins with data. Get the data, and then develop a theory that fits the data. First the data, then the model, all right? And that's just not the way actual science has unfolded. So for example, he confronted this sprawl of isolated laws of electricity and of magnetism, and they were separate fields with a sprawl of laws, Ohm's law, Faraday's laws, for currents and magnets. And he thought, this is just a bloody sprawl of isolated things. It's ugly. Can I unify it in a clean, aesthetically satisfactory theory? And he was able to do that. He unified them in electromagnetic theory. That's why it's called electromagnetic theory, because it combined those two in the famous Maxwell's equations. And it turns out those equations entail the existence of electromagnetic waves that had never even been imagined. So he's got these equations, then holy mackerel, there should be waves. And Hertz goes out and looks for them and finds them. And today we call them radio waves, and they're the basis of all modern telecommunications, an incredibly practical discovery. But the theory preceded the observation. Without the theory, you don't know what to look for, what data to even collect. And there are lots of other examples. Einstein's, that light should bend in a gravitational wave, purely theoretical result, and then Eddington tromps all over the planet to make the measurement and succeeds. Newton himself and Higgs boson, all of these things, in a lot of these cases, the models precede and dictate data collection. All right? So again, when somebody says, well, how can you even start building a model without data? You say, well, buzz off. That's happened many times, and it's been very productive, and, I'll let you know. Another goal, and now we'll show you a little bit of actual modeling, is to simply raise important questions in arresting ways. And you're going to I didn't know this when I was making up my talk, but you're going to build this model in this course. And it's called an opinion dynamics model, but it's very general. It's a model of influence, and we call it an opinion dynamics model. And it's very, very simple. Again, one theme, I think, of this course and of my field anyway, is that you try to build simple models that are revealing and surprising. And so here's a really simple model. Imagine 1,000 agents, 500 have the blue opinion, and 500 have the opinion red. I'm going to put them in fixed positions on a lattice and activate them at random. They're just going to take turns at random. And there's a single rule that everyone will obey when they're activated. Choose a random other within your action radius. I'll tell you what that is. And that agent adopts your opinion. They get flipped to your color. Okay? You're a peanut butter eater, and they're a sushi eater, and they land next to you, and you try sushi. Okay? And the action radius is simply how many squares, north, south, east, and west, you can flip people. All right? So radius 1 means I can only flip my immediate neighbors. Radius 2 means I can go 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Okay? Very simple idea. And these agents have no convictions, of course. They simply believe whatever the last guy told them. I'm red, Flaminio's blue, he comes over, blue, oh, okay, I'm blue. So what happens, right, if everybody just flips each other like this? They start with equal numbers of red and blues. They pick somebody at random and they turn them to their color. What happens? Why should anything happen at all? Why should anything happen? You flip me, I flip you. Why not just permanent flux, nothing settles down to anything? Right? I mean, I think if someone came along the street and said, hey, mister, I've got this model, what'll happen? I said, I don't know. I mean, why should anything happen? Okay? So you start with random opinions, here they are, and let's iterate forward with radius 2, okay? So I can pick anybody within 2 squares of me and flip them to my color. All right? And what happens in that case is you get one color. It's total monopoly. It always runs to one color. It could be blue, it could be red, but it always runs away. Competitive exclusion, perhaps, something like that. And that's the equilibrium, the state it arrives at. But the non-equilibrium dynamics can be incredibly complicated. Here's one example, but I have another one. Pardon the first screenshot. Oops, sorry. Okay, now this is not in the slideshow mode, so I can't run this. Flaminio, we have a problem. Is this right? No, yeah. I can't run the movies if it's in this mode.
Yeah, there's a video?
Yeah, it should show
Trying to.
maybe it'll do it. No. Oh yeah, it's running. Okay, good. Okay, sorry. All right, so you're seeing this. This is how it unfolds for a particular random seed. So this is that rule. And the trajectory is incredibly complicated. I mean, again, I might be able to prove mathematically that it always runs away to one color. But I might also be very interested in the non-equilibrium dynamics. And for that, I need some sort of actual time-dependent, model. So here's what's happening. It looks like blue's going to take over the world, but red also does well, and now they're battling. Okay, and it goes on like this for quite a while. I'm sorry I can't seem to advance this movie by hand, and I'm not sure we want to watch the entire thing. If you take my word for it, it's quite a drama, right? Wild plot twists and developments. And it eventually looks like red's going to win. I mean, we're really hoping, but because we're sick of watching, that blue will win. But then red takes over, and so it goes, right? In this incredibly complicated, there we go, now white, that's good, stay there, I want that. Okay, well, we'll figure this out. Anyway, it eventually arrives at red victory, okay? That's for radius 2. What if we now do radius 1? So people have less, their action radius is half what it was. Now what happens? Again, why should should anything change at all? Why not you get the same run? Or something, right? What happens now, we had global monopoly at radius 2. At radius 1, we end up with diversity. This is the equilibrium, where there are patches of reds and blues. So you get local monopolies, but global diversity, right? And you might call that polarization. You end up with rigid, there's a red, totally committed to red, and another group totally committed to blue, and they're polarized and are locally patchy. Okay? Very different result, and very different dynamics also. Let me see if I can run this thing. See, this is a lot less complicated. It sorts itself out, runs that equilibrium. Now, a very important point about all this is these movies are all these eye candy movies that you can build. Every one of them is one sample path of a stochastic process, right? You will learn how to do this using something called behavior space, which is very handy. But you'd never publish one run of the model. It's like I hit the go button and this is what happened. That's just nuts. It's fun and informative, but you'd have to run these models many times and build up some kind of respectable statistical portrait of their behavior over many random realizations. So when you see a movie like this, it's a fun eye candy thing, but it's one point in a stochastic space of events, each one of which is a trajectory of this kind, okay? So don't be naive in the way you consume or present this sort of work, all right? But even this simple model, it makes these points, these central themes, a couple of them. Crude individual agents can yield complex social dynamics that are very hard to anticipate. I mean, we have agents who are completely indifferent about opinions, and yet they generate a polarized society. And if I'd shown you the polarized society first, you might say, well, everyone has to be rigidly opinionated because they're stuck in these positions. But they really don't care at all, They just believe what the last guy flipped them to believe. They're totally uncommitted to anything, but you get polarization. And similarly, you may encounter or may know already Thomas Schelling's great model about segregation, which has a similar type of result, that you get very strong segregation spatially, even through very weak preferences for the race of your neighbor. The Schelling agents are still racist, of course, because they care at all what the color of their neighbor is. But even if it's a very weak preference, you still get very strong segregation. Again, very counterintuitive thing. So that's one theme. A second theme that's important to us, I think, is that a small change in the rule, a small change in the radius, produces a huge change in the emergent macroscopic pattern, right? At r equals 1, both species survive, and at r equals 2, only one. So ABMs allow that kind of exploration, and I think more important, they train you, invite you, seduce you into asking the question. I think that's the main thing, right? When you see a complex social dynamic or pattern, you ask, is there a simple generative mechanism? And sometimes, shockingly, there is. Okay, those are spatial games. Here's a non-spatial one, and I think is also very interesting. So imagine I gave each of you $100. So the initial wealth distribution in our class is flat. It's uniform. Everybody gets $100. All right? I call your names at random. If your name is called, you pick a random classmate, give her $1. And that just repeats. I keep calling names. If you're out of dollars, then I skip you. But that's it, right? I call your name, you give somebody else $1. That's it. No dollars enter the system, no dollars leave the system. That's all that's going on. Simple micro rule. What happens to the macroscopic dollar distribution? It was flat at the beginning, all right? And again, why should anything happen, right? If you ask me, sir, I have this game, what do you think will happen? It starts out even, people just give and get at random. Why shouldn't it just stay uniform? I mean, why should it do anything? Any thoughts about what actually happens? And must actually happen.
Fluctuates.
Sorry?
The distribution fluctuates, maybe become normal.
That's a good thought. That's what I would say. I'd say it probably fluctuates and maybe becomes, I don't know, some universal type distribution, normal distribution, something. Perfectly good intuition. So here's what actually happens. I start with everybody with $100, and they just keep trading at random. Again, I apologize, I can't really grab these movies and make them faster. I'm tracking something called the entropy of the system, which needn't detain us. But the thing is getting more and more skewed. It's a skewed distribution. You may have heard of power law distributions and things like this. This is actually not quite a power law distribution, but it's a skewed one. What the heck? Right? Why should any individuals be getting richer than others? Right? I'm just giving people tokens and totally random. But it does, and if you run it lots and lots, after many cycles, you get this literally an exponential distribution after 20,000 cycles. Why in the world could that be? Why is that happening? What's the intuition behind that? Any thoughts? Why purely random exchange should end up with wealth disparities and skewed distributions, things like this? Well, here's the intuition. If you think of three agents, A has no dollars, B has one, and C has one. How many ways are there for A to get one? There are two ways. B can give him one, or C can give him one. How many ways are there for agent A to get two? There's only one way to get two. That is, B gives one and C gives one. So think of if the x-axis is the number of ways for A to get that amount. There's only one way for A to get everything. So the curve is highest at the left. But there's lots of ways for her to get one or more. So the curve is lowest at the right. So the distribution is high at the left and low at the right and skewed. And it has to be skewed and can be proven rigorously that it has to be skewed using something called maximum entropy techniques. All right? So if you think of it this way, how many ways are there for the person to get a ton? Well, there are very few ways because everybody has to give them their money. But how many ways are there for somebody to end up with a little bit? A million ways, lots of ways to do that. So there's lots of ways to have a little money and very few ways to have a lot of money and ways in between, and it's skewed, okay? But again, and it turns out that happens to be a crucial distribution in physics. It's a Boltzmann distribution, and it turns out a huge range of things self-organize into that kind of pattern. City sizes, species area relations, firm sizes, wealth distributions. There's a whole field of econophysics based at Oxford that's built around these ideas, okay? And again, really simple rule, but has vast range of realizations, implications. So Is that a really plausible economic mechanism? And do actual economies work that way? People just give dollars and get dollars. Let's suppose it were, and you get this inequality. Does that mean that inequality is immutable, right? How robust is that? What if a few people don't behave like that? What if a few people are just nice, you know, and they don't give to random others? So let's take a look at that with an ABM.
But
Yeah.
when you can switch dension, but we have the same distribution.
I'm sorry?
I mean, we put the mechanism and we see this distribution, and we say, okay, there's a huge range of things that so-called organizing to this kind of pattern. But when each pattern may show up the same, but it's not the code.
Very, very important point. So you could generate something in lots of different ways. So there may be very different mechanisms that generate the same distribution. And I agree with you. I wouldn't say that it's the same mechanism in cities, for example, and people don't just choose a city and go there. So very good point. I agree. But it's very tantalizing to see that such a universal, ubiquitous distribution can be generated in a simple way. So you might think of these other things as departures from that way. But I'll come back to this very important point you raised, and that's, you know, even if you generate something, it doesn't mean it's the only way to generate it. So it's a candidate explanation. It's not the only one. So good, very good point. Okay, so we have this distribution. Let's see what happens if people change the rule a tiny bit. So what if some agents are nice? They don't give them $1 just to a random other agent. They pick an agent who's below the median income, and they give them $1. They're nice. They're not just random. What fraction of this population needs to be nice to change that distribution? All right? So with an agent-based model, we can just change the micro rule and see. And this, again, this is code you can write in a couple weeks. I mean, it's very simple programming. So we started with the previous skewed distribution. It's good to start there and see how it departs from that. Do you need a big fraction to make it more symmetric? Now maybe it would be more normal, less skewed. So here's this. And I'm afraid, again, I can't advance these, but it's worth watching. We're just going to let this burn in. Okay, we're going to start at the old equilibrium, because we're trying to see do you perturb the old equilibrium? So it's a good practice to start in the old equilibrium and then change the rule and see if it drives it to some new state. And at this red line happens at 20,000 cycles, and then now they've adopted the new rule. A couple percent of them are just nice. Most everybody else is still just utterly random. They couldn't care less about poor people.
This graph shows that the entropy is.
Yes. And again, I can't run this, endlessly, but it becomes much more normally distributed. It becomes symmetrical. It's not equal, it's not flat, but it's also not skewed, right? So there's more mass on the poor side than there was. And again, you can show that it turns out to have a Laplace distribution, which is symmetric. But again, as to our themes of the course and the field, here's a small micro change that yields a big macro change, right? And the macro change can happen very abruptly also. And epidemics, financial panics, revolutions, I think are good examples of abrupt social change. And I think this is a major theme of complex systems research here and everywhere. So a small micro change can generate abrupt macro change. Another key point. Sir?
How did you define entropy in this context? So what is entropy?
If we had a blackboard, I'd show you better. We could. It's the sum. For every state, there's a probability of the state. So you take the probability of the state, multiply it by the log of that probability, and add that up over all possible states. That's the entropy of the system. All right? And the second law of thermodynamics is that that's increasing in the universe. But very good point that it's not in this case. All right?
So
It's
implies that it's a closed system.
yeah. Yeah, and it's conserving dollars. But yeah, entropy. And Claude Shannon invented the field, and there's a whole field of maximum entropy. You can show that if you posit that systems maximize entropy, then you can deduce that those are the distributions they have to converge to. And it puts a very beautiful unifying theory on all the distributions, the entire exponential family, normal, exponential, gamma, all of them turn out to be instances of maximum entropy. So it's a huge unifying move. And very recent, I mean, E.T. Jaynes, Jaynes, really invented this move in 1957. So I commend this to you. It's very beautiful. All right, so again, these are also examples of what we would call bottom-up modeling. Right? Is the wealth distribution skewed? That's statistics. Why is the wealth distribution skewed? We're looking for some bottom-up generative mechanism. How might I change the wealth distribution? Change the micro mechanism to induce the macro change. You really can't get at that with macro to macro modeling. All right? If you have a regression that says, total consumption is a function of total income, taxes, government spending, investment, all these things, that doesn't tell me, what would happen if individual tastes change or people spread, preferences for different commodities or these other things. I want a bottom-up account, and having the macro to macro model might let me predict, right? It might say, if I raise taxes by X, consumption will fall by Y. But it's predictive, but that regularity to an agent-based modeler is what we're trying to grow. You're saying, here are the regression equations. Why are those the truth, right? So you're trying to explain something that might be predictive or not. But the idea is, when we say I've explained it, it means I've been able to grow it in a population of cognitively plausible agents. That's what I mean by an explanation in this world, right? So it's micro to macro social science, and the generative explanation is what I call that. And the motto, if you like, is if you didn't grow it, you didn't explain it. But that doesn't mean there may be many ways to grow it, right? And we'll come back to that. All right? But you can falsify a candidate mechanism by showing that it doesn't generate the observed output, or not frequently enough, or not closely enough. All right? But this is the concept of agent-based modeling, that you try to generate the thing from the bottom up. And when people say to me, well, couldn't you just get that using regression? I say, well, couldn't you get what exactly? I think the answer is no. If what you mean by get that is demonstrate how the micro-macro mapping works, you couldn't get at that with just the regression equation. You might predict total consumption, but I'm not explaining the economic dynamics. Okay? But every one of these is just a candidate, and there may be many candidates, and you can falsify them, though, by showing that that really doesn't generate anything, right? And this is an important thing that you'll also learn about, is the issue of testing and calibration. And things in this area have advanced dramatically since the early days of Schelling's model and so forth, which he actually made up flipping coins on an airplane trip. Here's a nice essay, Some Fun 30 years ago, that he wrote in a book on computational economics by Tesfazione and Ken Judd, where he says, I was on an airplane with a bunch of coins and I started flipping them, and I was noticing that there were clusters of heads and tails and so forth. So of course he didn't, again, it wasn't like, I'm going to build a model of spatial segregation and I'm going to do this thing. He was noodling around and he came up with this thought, and it turned out to be interesting. All right? So noodling around is a tried and true method of scientific advance. Someone says, what are you doing? I'm noodling around. But today we can test the fit between the real world patterns and the ones generated from the bottom up in these models. And my wonderful colleague Erez Hatna at NYU, there's a very nice example published in JAS, which does use a more elaborate version of the Schelling segregation model to really chart segregation in Israel over a broad period of time. And agent models, I think, are very important in geography. I think they're very important in disease, economics. In infectious disease modeling, they've really changed the field dramatically. And you can do modeling of contagious dynamics at all scales, from playground to planet. And let me try to show you some of that, because it's a very nice application of agents. So here's a completely toy epidemic model, and can give very fundamental insights into epidemiology and other contagious phenomena, I would argue. So here's the idea. We're going to just have a little playground epidemic. Again, you could code this probably tomorrow if you stay with the class. Kids just run around the playground. Blue kids are healthy, red kids are sick. It's a highly transmissible bug that ultimately kills anybody who gets it. So one kid is sick at first, he's a red kid. The others are blue. They move around. When a red bumps into a blue, he gives them the disease with some probability. That turns the kid red. And then they die with some probability. Okay, that's all that happens. What happens? So they're milling around. Can everybody sort of see that? Should we change the lighting, or is it okay? It's okay? Good. So pretty soon, blue kids are turning red kids are dying. You could think of them as going to the infirmary, but I'm more morbid than that. I like to think of them dying. So, all right. And again, I'm not sure we need to watch this to the dismal end. Everybody gets sick because they can't escape, right? They're trapped in the playground. Every kid get it, and they all died. All right. So again, when you get it, you die with some probability every period. Okay. Now, what if I make the bug twice as lethal, so that the probability that you die every period is double what it was in that run? So it's clearly much worse for you if you get the bug. Is it worse for the society? Sorry.
Not necessarily, because if they die early, they cannot...
Perfect. Exactly right. They can die before they transmit. So it's much worse for the person, but you know, in this sense, it's better for society. I'm not recommending that you should have more lethal bugs, but I'm just saying this is another important thing. Double the lethality. It's certainly worse if you get it. Whoops. See if these will run. But just as our colleague here says, the sick kids die before they can transmit. So you get a less lethal epidemic, even though it's much worse for the individual. Again, I don't think that would be evident to people just on the corner. If you said, hey, mister, I've got this bug, make it twice as bad, the epidemic's twice as bad. Yeah, no, not right. All right, so it's not worse for society because the infectives die before they can transmit. All right, so let's go back to the first run. Everybody gets it and they all die. There were 100 kids. Now let's imagine a perfect vaccine, and I vaccinate 60 of the kids, and I color them yellow. All right? So I vaccinated 60 kids survive, no? I think that's what I'd think. I'd think, yeah, you know, if I vaccinate 60 of the 100, 60 survive. End of the story. No, you think not the end of the story. Why? Yes. If that were true, the only survivors would be yellow.
Not necessarily, because if you have 60, they cover more space, so it's more difficult for the disease to spread.
That's true. That's true. And here's what happens. Just graphically, though, you know, I've colored the 60 vaccinated kids yellow. If only they survived, then all you'd see at the end is yellow kids, right? But that's not what you see. Here they are. Right, and they're control rods on the entire reaction, right? There's some spreading, to be sure. All right, but more than 60 survive. And the vaccinees confer secondary protection. And that's what we call herd immunity in epidemiology. And the interesting implication, of course, is that I don't have to vaccinate everybody to crush the epidemic, right? I just have to vaccinate enough so that it fizzles out. And we can use models to find that level of vaccination that confers herd immunity on the population. It differs by bugs, right? Differs by how contagious the bug is. Sir?
Yeah, to that point, all of that depends on, because you mentioned there's some probability of the virus spreading and some probability that it's lethal.
Right.
And it all depends on those levels as well.
Absolutely.
And how do you kind of, I mean, with the model, I suppose you can test what would happen in different levels of different probabilities, I suppose. So at what extent does the lethality influence certain outcomes, or what level does the probability of spreading
Right.
influence certain outcomes?
Yes, exactly right. There's a beautiful unified theory of diseases that I could show you, with a little bit of, with 5 minutes. But yes, there's a very clean way to answer that question using something called the SIR epidemic model. But I don't know that I'll eat up too much of the clock let's come back to it if there's time. All right? Yeah. Okay. Very good question. The answer is yes, we can do all that. So that was a toy playground model. Here's a non-toy model, an environmental threat. This is a full-scale model of Los Angeles with all the buildings correct and all the traffic flow on a normal day in Los Angeles. And we're introducing an airborne toxic contaminant that you'll see is this red billow of horrible stuff coming along. So this is a model we published in PLOS1 that combines computational fluid dynamics, which is actual, serious physics of fluid dynamics, atmospheric dynamics, with an actual model of Los Angeles that's accurate of all the structural engineering about permeability of buildings to these airborne contaminants is physically correct. The traffic is normal LA traffic. And we filled these buildings up with agents. And if they simply pour out into the street, it's color-coded for velocity. That's still pretty, maybe we should darken the room a tiny bit. Can we do that? Can we make it a little darker in here? Maybe it would help, I'm not sure. Well, yeah, a little better, okay. But the idea, I should start it again because it's too far along now. Oops. If they all just pour out into the street, if they all try to evacuate at once, then everybody's in this massive congestion in the middle of Los Angeles, and they do worse than if they'd stayed in their buildings, right? So if everybody tries to get out, nobody gets out, okay? So there's a whole question of how do you orchestrate the evacuation of a city like this, and most of the world's gonna live in these giant mega cities, or already do. So the whole issue is evacuation a thing of the past? Is evacuation really not? We're in the post-evacuation age, and we need to think differently about how to respond to environmental crises, man-made or otherwise. Here's another view of that work from different perspectives. Now again, this is not toy modeling at all, right? This is very high-performance computing that combines atmospheric physics, traffic dynamics, and all these other things. So it's very industrial strength, and although I'll show you, we build very big models in NetLogo. This happens to have been written in Python that you may have encountered. Here's that picture you saw. Here's looking down on the plume as it spreads. Here's another perspective. And of course, what you're tracking is how many people are exposed and what is the level of their exposure, and is it above some toxic level? So when you assess policies, you're asking, how am I affecting the survival of people? Sir?
I go back to your question regarding what do you want to do with the model.
Right.
In this case, you cannot validate because it's the city of LA.
Yeah.
It's to explain. You cannot also predict, no? In this case.
Yeah, I would say I don't think you can predict exactly, but you might use models to prevent or protect, even if you can't predict. Right? You're saying I don't know exactly what will happen. But here's the full, I call them petabyte playbooks, right? We can run a zillion scenarios. And for every contaminant, and for every time of day, and whatever the atmospheric chemistry is, we can say, here's what an optimal response would look like. Some people would shelter in place, some people would evacuate. Those who evacuate take these routes, not those routes. There's carpooling. There's also other things you can do. And you build up a huge library of those, and then if something does happen, you say, okay, that's scenario 4,587,000,000D, and we're going to start there and then in real time try to make adaptations that improve the response. So you can't literally predict what will happen, but you can say, if this happens, here's an optimal course of activity. I can't predict the next flu strain, but if it does emerge, these are the people I want to get antiviral drugs, something like that. But again, just to say, playground to planet, we looked at playgrounds and so forth, this is a whole other story. But again, it's something you can do with agent-based modeling and you can do with teams of people. You don't have to do agent-based modeling alone either, right? And I certainly don't know the computational physics of it. Anyway, all right, so here's another large-scale model that's urban scale. It's a model we did of New York City. Erez was certainly the lead on this. And it was in response to Zika. We were invited to build a model by New York City to study Zika, which is a mosquito-borne virus. And we built every census tract in New York, 7.5 million people, several million mosquitoes, all census tracts in the city. And there's a lot going on. Zika is very complicated because it has many distribution, many ways to spread. Mosquito to human, human to human, mother to child. So we tried to capture all the ways you can get Zika. And we had very good data from New York City on age, where people are from, sex, marital status, some data on sexual partners, locations of work. We keep track of people. Are you susceptible? Are you incubating infectious? Recovered with respect to mosquito transmission, recovered with respect to sexual transmission. We did have some data on sexual networks. This is a bold new area to get data on social networks. But social media is helping. I mean, I think there's going to be a big revolution in how we measure social networks. And their home and work locations, okay? And mosquitoes also have states. They can be in, the way you actually get it is there's contaminated blood from somewhere, and a mosquito gets hungry and bites you, and then they're contaminated with the blood, and when they feed on the next person, they give them the blood, all right? So it all depends on how, are they infected, what's their infectious period, their bite rate, all this crazy detail. And the life course of a mosquito, all these things. We found people who know all this stuff, which is unbelievable. How mosquitoes feed, and then where the hell are all these mosquitoes in New York? We found the one guy who knows every mosquito personally, and unbelievable guy. And he shared all his trap data. So we have all the mosquito trapping data for all of New York City, all right? So you know where the bugs are, and people go and come from work and home, and whatever they do, they tromp across these areas. And if they're walking across a high mosquito density area, they have a high probability of getting bitten. And if they're low mosquito area, so it's a giant heat map of mosquitoes, really. And we built it in NetLogo, and it has 7.5 million individuals plus a few million bugs. So this business that you can't build in big models in NetLogo, that's baloney. You can build very big models in NetLogo. And the other is, people say, well, it doesn't run fast. Well, I mean, first of all, it depends on how many, how can you distribute it? I mean, we have access to the Courant Institute, cluster. So, I mean, you can make it run quite fast. But that aside, this whole business about, well, it's not fast enough. I mean, if I'm going to get at some eternal truth, I don't care if I have to wait a week to learn the eternal truth. I mean, if somebody says, if it's crisis in real time, then it needs to run fast. But if I'm trying to really understand some fundamentally complicated process, I don't know about you, but I'm willing to wait a couple days for the answer. I start the program, and it's sort of, okay, it isn't so fast. Tell me in a week. I'll go to the beach and come back, and I'll have some fabulous insight. I mean, the whole business about speed, I think is kind of has to be taken with a grain of salt. The model outputs, of course, are, again, all these cases of Zika, and we analyze them by looking at different probabilities. And the interesting thing about the Zika, and we have blue is mosquito transmission, red is sexual transmission, okay? And what's interesting is that even if there's no bugs, you can still have transmission. So if a government isn't aware of that, they might think, oh, you know, there's no bugs around, all the bugs are dormant, so just go back to having unprotected sex, there's no pool of transmissible infection. That's not true. The thing stays in the system through sexual transmission and can even increase the total contaminated blood supply, so that when the mosquitoes come back the next year, it's a much worse epidemic because there's much more infected humans around. So it's an interesting dynamic between sexual transmission and mosquito-borne transmission and seasonality and so on. Again, that's another urban scale model. Here's the next scale up on Playground to Planet. This is a US national model, 300 million agents, all calibrated to census data. We have all the zip code, inter-zip code travel. You know, if you're in zip code X, what's the probability you go zip code Y? There are 30,000 zip codes, so that's a 900 million entry matrix. Not something you fool around with by hand. And it includes homes, schools, workplaces, hospitals. And we built this for NIH to study lots of different diseases, but swine flu, bird flu, all of these other things. Again, I apologize for the corrupted first image. But black if you're healthy, red if you're sick, blue if you're over the bug. And it starts in LA. I'm a New Yorker, so everything bad starts in LA. And you can see the thing spreading. This is about a 250-day. It's in Tomax, John Parker and me. He was the lead software developer. And again, you can ask, is it too late to close schools? If you have limited supplies of antiviral drugs, who should get them? So forth. But again, just to show you the kind of work you can do, you can build toy models. You can also, again, build very, very realistic high population models and populate them with realistic data and so forth, and actually reconstruct past epidemics and so forth. So, you know, hardcore policy type modeling. We even built a planetary scale one, the entire planet, that I wrote a little piece about in Nature in 2009, and John and I, again, published this in Tomax. And, well, I should tell you, the motivation for this modeling was, you know, this was bird flu. And the question is, you know, you may recall, bird flu was very deadly if you catch it, but you can only catch it from a chicken. And the question was, if that is circulating with regular seasonal flu, the two bugs could recombine and produce something really horrific that's transmissible like seasonal flu, but deadly like bird flu. And the question was, you know, if that happens, if that evolutionary move happens in Asia, should we send the entire US stockpile to Asia to crush the thing there, or withhold the whole stockpile for Americans in the event that it goes global? Okay, simple question. And the answer, of course, is, well, it depends. Like all modelers, the answer is it depends. And it depends on when you catch its emergence. And I won't go into that, save to show you that this is the level of modeling we're talking about there. Planetary scale modeling, where it starts in Asia. Same color scheme, black healthy, red sick, blue recovered. And it spreads around the planet. And there's a bunch of models like this at Northeastern and Florida, which really have encoded the entire FAA, you know, all the airlines and the rest of it. So it's not a revealing toy model. It's a very, very complicated high fidelity model. And I will say that often in my experience, you have much more impact with the toy model because policymakers can understand it. Whereas if you present someone with a very complicated model and tell them it shows you something really counterintuitive and you should do something really novel and unexpected, they're politicians, you know, they're going to say, well, that's too scary, I'm not doing that. But if you make them help you build the model and become part of that process, they have some stake in it, and more importantly, they understand what's going on. So they might actually be more inclined to adopt your novel avenue than if you give them the better model. All right. So one important agenda then is to populate these big models in epi, sociology, economics with cognitively plausible agents. And to date, there are very few alternatives to the rational actor that you'll find in economics textbooks and game theory, right? Despite lots of evidence from Herb Simon, Dan Kahneman, you know, huge amount of psychological research that, you know, actual people don't behave like the perfectly rational actor. So is there an alternative to the rational actor? And my candidate is this person, Agent Zero. And I published this book. I had the tremendous luck of having a 5-year award to work on this, and I don't think I completely wasted my time. This is the result. It's called Agent Zero Toward Neurocognitive Foundations for Generative Social Science. The idea is do generative social science, but let's see if we can come up with a slightly more plausible agent. And it's the third in a trilogy of books that Flaminio has already mentioned. But all of them are about this idea, generative explanation. And I think this is really in many ways what's at stake in agent-based modeling, is what do you mean by an explanation of a social reality? To us, to me, it means to explain it, you demonstrate how it could emerge on timescales of interest in a population of cognitively plausible agents. Does the micro world, M, generate the macro explanandum, right? The pattern you're trying to explain? And if it does, then M, the micro explanatory candidate. And as I said before, the motto might be, if you didn't grow it, you didn't explain it. So for any x, not g of x implies not e of x, right? If you're feeling unduly formal. Not the converse. It's not true that any old way of growing it is explanatory. And it's not unique, right? There might be many micro-specifications that generate it, in which case you have more work to do, as in any other science where they're competing hypotheses, or you need to design experiments that'll sort those out. But this is not a problem unique to agent-based modeling. So generative sufficiency is a necessary condition for explanation, but it's a very different idea than, if you talk to a game theorist and they say, here's this pattern, what's an explanation? They say, oh, game in which the pattern is a Nash equilibrium of the game. Nash equilibrium of the game. Or if you talk to someone, Gary Becker, or he's passed, but other people would say, well, furnish some functional with respect to which that trajectory is an extremal trajectory, as in macroeconomics, or furnish a regression relating aggregate variables that have as a dependent variable the thing you're trying to explain. And we're really saying, no, those are not what we have in mind. What we have in mind is a micro specification that generates the macro regularity in a population of cognitively plausible agents. Now, what are those? What are some desiderata of a cognitively plausible agent? I think plausible agents have emotions. And I was focusing especially on fear, which plays a big role, and whose neuroscience is really kind of well in hand. We know something about fear. They have an emotional module then, but they also have some deliberative capacity, but it's bounded, a la Herb Simon, Dan Kahneman, Tversky, all these experimental behavioral economists. They're not perfectly rational. They're boundedly rational, right? So that's a part of this agent also. And they're connected to other agents that are emotionally driven, not always, often unawares to them. They don't know they're emotionally driven, but they actually are. And they're in networks with others that are like this. And all of those things might matter: emotion, bounded rationality, social connection. So I built Agent Zero to have those features. I said this creature needs to have an affective component, a deliberative component, and a social module. Each of those have to be grounded in neuroscience, where we know something, and those interact to produce individual behavior. And when you put a bunch of the individuals together, you get collective phenomena that are pretty arresting in health, conflict, economics, even law. So my, humble claim was, I want to get the synthesis started. I want an agent that synthesizes affective, deliberative, social components. We can work more on the components, and I've published more recent papers on lots of different ways to instantiate the affective, deliberative, and social modules. But what I'm insisting on is that they be present, that there's some fusion of those. They can all be provisional, but I want, it's an old idea. Hume said, reason is a slave to the passions, and many philosophers have said, man is a social animal. So I wanted some agent that convolves those, that has a passion component, a reason component, and a social component, but it has to be formal. There's a lot of empirical criticism of the rational actor, but they're gripes, right? Even decisive experiments are just gripes. until you have an alternative model, right? Samuelson said, you can only beat a model with a model. Agent zero to be formal. It has to be mathematical and computational, all right? And I think I met those minimal requirements. And before telling you a little about the equations, I won't drag you through them in detail. What's the big picture? And I think the easiest way to explain agent zero is in a kind of violence interpretation, where agents are soldiers in a foreign land occupying an indigenous region, all right? And I'm always rooting for the indigenous sites, but here's what happens. They're out there in this foreign land, and they can destroy sites. I'll just walk you through this. Pictures are better than 1,000 words. All right, so here's this landscape of yellow individuals, and I've colored them a little differently just so you can tell them apart. And they just are in these locations sitting there. They're not agent zero type agents. They're just creatures who live in this land that the agent zero agents are occupying, all right? There are 3 agent zero agents. The entire book is 3 agents. So it's not a big, massive model. I thought it's the smallest model that lets you have a majority. So I thought keep it as simple as possible, really as stripped down as I could dream up. So they're connected to one another. They have weights, and I'll talk about those. But here are 3 agent zero type agents. This one never moves. Okay, he's just going to stay here for reasons that will become evident. These ones are moving around in this area of the world where ambushes are happening. Some of the yellow sites are blowing up. These are, whatever, IEDs or ambushes or attacks or something. But they could also be toxic assets or infections or Oreo cookies or what have you. We'll come back to these things. But for the moment, imagine that they're rebels, they're insurgents who are blowing up or ambushing these occupying guys. All right? And the occupiers are doing 2 things. First, they're fear conditioning on these aversive stimuli, and I'll talk about fear conditioning. They're not, part of it is simply they are unconsciously forming an association between yellow indigenous sites and some scary, horrible, adverse event. And there's a nice, simple mathematical theory of conditioned fear, which is you don't decide to be afraid. I mean, if I throw a snake in your lap, you're not deciding to be afraid, you're freezing. Later, you might say, oh, it's just Josh and he's a rubber snake. But that's a deliberation, and it happens through other channels and much delayed. So they're fear conditioning, first of all. They're developing some level of fear of yellow sites. They're also making a statistical appraisal. Their deliberative component is saying, what's the relative frequency of bad actors over all the actors in my region? So what's the statistical probability of one of these yellow sites blowing up? They're not Bayesians, they're not fancy, they're just frequentists in their vision radius. And the sum of those, the affect, the reason, the passion and the reason, Hume's 2 axes, we're just going to add those. And that's the agent's disposition to blow up some sites in retaliation. And the sum of those has to be over some threshold. There's a threshold, an action threshold. Same for all agents. But it's just very simple. There's their affect plus their probability greater than their threshold. Then they blow up some sites within their radius. This is what they're doing. But they're also connected to others. So the fact that my neighbor is freaked out makes me more freaked out. And the fact that I'm freaked out makes him more freaked out. And even this guy's becoming freaked out, even though nothing is blown up anywhere near him. Okay? And they destroy sites in response. But what's dark and interesting is that so does he, even though he's never been subjected to any attack. All right? So they're sampling in their von Neumann neighborhood, north, south, east, west, and so is this agent. And even though this agent has never been subjected to any attack, he nonetheless blows up his village also. So here's this, one of the important parables of the book, I call Slaughter of Innocents parable. Right, and again, this is all NetLogo. I wrote all of it in NetLogo. Okay, and that's that run. And again, it's a sample path, but we've done quite a lot of analysis now. All right, is that clear? Is it? Okay. All right, so here's the setup in a little more detail. There's some threshold. You can flee the snake, raid the icebox, join the lynch mob, refuse vaccine, dump stock, all these things. the agents have a binary action they can take, do something or not do it. So it's a 0 or 1 output. And they each have a non-negative real threshold, tau. And again, what's interesting is that they can do lots of different things even if they have the same threshold. So I didn't even explore different thresholds because I thought that was kind of cheating. So they have some, and you can imagine that as just 0, whatever you like, simple, there has to be some trigger. And their solo disposition to act is the sum. The affect is V of t because that's what the psychologists use. And the probability is P of t, all right? And their disposition, if alone, is passion plus reason, right? Passion plus reason. It's kind of the Hume picture. And it's also nice, why would they add things? It's nice because if they're competing, if passion and reason are competing for under a given threshold, you know, how would passion is saying do it, reason is saying, you know, you shouldn't do it, and you do it if the passion exceeds the threshold by more than the threshold exceeds reason. And if you do a little bit of math, that's the same as the sum exceeds a number. All right. But they're connected to one another, right? So they have their solo disposition, but they also carry weights. And I grow these in the model. They're endogenous weights because I want to keep the number of variables tiny. So the total disposition is your solo disposition plus the sum of the weighted solo dispositions of others. All right? And the action rule is just act if total exceeds threshold. And if you subtract the total from the subtract the threshold from the total as here, then the rule is very, very simple. It's just act if your net disposition is positive. Okay? Very simple idea that I think has a lot of generative fertility, as I'll argue. The important point is that it's dispositional contagion, not imitation of behavior, where actually nobody's action actually appears in this equation. It's just dispositional contagion. And the mechanism of action isn't imitation of behavior, as I say. So we're suspending a kind of monkey see, monkey do imitation model that's central to a lot of the literature on social transmission. The real problem with imitation of observable action is there's no mechanism for the first actor. I mean, the first actor has no one to imitate. So how does he get going? All right? And I think noise is kind of cheating. So I designed this to be, it's really dispositional contagion, not imitation of behavior. And we'll talk about why that's interesting. So okay, again, not to belabor this, under the hood are actual equations that are described in great detail in the book. And I really don't want to go through this too much. This is a generalization of the fear conditioning equation I'll talk about, and relative frequency, and then the weighted strength, the scaled affective homophily are the weights. So there's really very few actual parameters. I never use any of this apparatus. I just use this. So there's a learning rate, one parameter, memory, another parameter, and this maximum associative strength, another. So there's and the threshold. There might be 4 parameters. So when people say agent-based models, you know, they have too many parameters, you don't know what the hell's going on. Well, this has maybe 4 parameters. So, you know, I think we know what's going on. It may be baloney, but it's not too many parameters. All right? So again, the goal is to get the synthesis started with plausible, testable modules. And I actually published 2 versions, one in differential equations, and another is agents. And I was saying I think there's a whole interesting area of how to make those talk to one another. But the subtitle is Toward Neurocognitive Foundations for Generative Social Science. We talked about generative social science. What is this neurocognitive stuff? And in fear, we care about fear acquisition and fear extinction, and we know something about the mechanism of fear acquisition and extinction. And most of the action takes place in the amygdaloid complex. And I talked to a lot of neuroscientists. I don't claim to understand this really, but I have their license to present it. So the amygdala circuit, and we know a lot about this. We can stain it and study it in great detail. But again, I don't really care where things are happening. I care that it's innate, automatic, fast, inaccessible to deliberation. The affective component is fear. And Joe Ledoux, my colleague at NYU, talks about the quick and dirty road. I throw the snake in your lap, your amygdala lights up and you freeze. You didn't think about it at all. Then other parts of the brain sweep in and say, wait, is that a rubber snake or just a garden snake? Or should you really, how scary is that snake? But that's delayed and deliberative and evidence-based when the first reaction is not learned, is not evidence-based, it's just evolved, okay? And we know a little bit about how to produce those associations. The classic example is of a fear conditioning trial is a shock, cuff, and a blue light. This is some subject's brain, and in the lower part is the amygdala activation after conditioning, and I'll tell you what that is. So there's a blue light. If I don't put any shock cuff on you and don't do anything, I just show you a blue light, your amygdala couldn't care less. Nothing happens in the amygdala. By contrast, if I put a shock cuff on you and you're walking along and I shock you, then you're startled and your amygdala recruits blood and starts to activate all these endocrinological and other responses. So now if I put the shock cuff on you and I start pairing blue light and shock, blue light shock, blue light shock, blue light shock, and then blue light alone, your amygdala lights up as if it were the shock, all right? So the conditioned response is the same as the unconditioned response to the shock alone, right? And that means you've been conditioned to fear the blue light like you do a shock. And we know a little bit about this, and there are very simple equations of it. Rescorla and Wagner published the canonical picture in 1972. And the idea is that the association between blue light and shock on Tuesday is the same as the same as the association on Monday, plus the learning rate times maximum association, which is 1, minus association yesterday. All right, so that's the idea, is that the gain in associative strength is a learning rate times maximum minus the associative strength from yesterday. And the learning rates depend on the surprise and salience of the conditioning, right? I mean, if it's not surprising, you don't learn much. And if it doesn't matter to you, you also don't learn much. So it has to be salient and surprising to get learning. And the learning just goes like this as I shock you and shock you and shock you. And eventually you have the maximum associative strength and treat the blue light just as if it were a shock. All right? Okay, and I'm not modeling the brain regions, I'm just saying this is the performance that architecture supports. I'm just modeling the performance, all right? But it's interesting, Hume himself thought this was his biggest breakthrough, and he writes, importantly for us, after the constant conjunction of two objects, blue light and shock, we are determined by custom alone to expect the one, shock, from the appearance of the other, the blue light. Having found in many instances that two kinds of objects, flame and heat, blue light, shock, have always been conjoined, then if flame or blue light is presented anew, the mind is carried by custom to expect the shock. Importantly, it is not by reasoning that we form the connection. All these operations are a species of natural instinct which no reasoning or process of the thought and understanding is able either to produce or to prevent. So this part of it is non-conscious, inaccessible to ratiocination. Sir?
I had a question. This is all extremely fascinating. Because, I've always wondered about the link between neuroscience and these models. I was wondering, in addition to, I guess, passion and reason, which can be easily modeled through these kinds of methods.
Yeah.
Is there the social element that you explained as well? You said passion, reason, and social was another component, where you talk about, for example, culture, you talk about, for example, values, things that you kind of integrate. Are those aspects also part of Agent Zero? And how do you kind of model those?
Separate, I mean, it's kind of, they're not part of Agent Zero. I mean, the only really the only thing in Agent Zero is fear, bounded rationality, and weights, and the stimulus pattern itself. So I didn't try to get off into other topics, but partly because I'm not really sure. We know a little bit about the neural correlates of all the things that are in Agent Zero, and I don't know what the neural correlates are of some of these other things. So I think those are all extensions that are worth pursuing.
Yeah, well, I was just wondering what your thoughts were about, I mean, I don't know to what extent this was really advanced or just but like with Cambridge Analytica, for example, they took all this Facebook data about people's interests and cultural inclinations, et cetera, and were able to kind of understand how they would react to certain situations based on these kinds of social factors.
Yeah, I think of that as predictive, macroscopic, empirical work. It's not the generative enterprise. Let's come back to this, because I think it's an important distinction. But no, that's not what this was about. Anyway, so here we have this thing that's not really reasoning. It's a bunch of other things. And it's a great thing, right? I mean, it helps us be scared of the right things. That's why we have it, right? Species without the fear apparatus are not around, because they didn't learn to fear hippopotamuses and lions and all these other things. But it's also very dangerous, right? You can get all these nefarious associations too. You know, light and shock, fear, but you can also have Vietnamese face, ambushes, and then, you know, these horrible events, the My Lai massacre, which I hope some of you have studied. Arab face, 9/11, terrible, invidious assumptions about the Quran. Japanese face, Pearl Harbor, internment. Dr. Tuskegee experiments, distrust. MMR vaccine, autism. You get this vaccine refusal, and so forth, right? All of these things are fear generated. And the other good/bad thing about fear is that it should persist, right? It doesn't make any sense to learn to be afraid of hippos today and then forget to stay afraid of them tomorrow, right? Those creatures are not around either. So the result, of course, is that affect, even if it's bad and nefarious and you know, still can stay above threshold long after the actual stimulus has stopped. And those creatures you saw in the movie, they keep killing even in zones where there's no aversive stimulus because the decay rate isn't sufficiently high. All right? Okay, and the full effective trajectory is acquisition and extinction. And we have lots of laboratory data on, mostly on vertebrates. These are rats, but we have the same wiring. So what I say is, you know, we don't fear what the rat fears, but we fear how the rat fears. And we fear a lot of the things that the rat fears too. They don't like snakes either. But in any event, if you like equations, this is one way to express all of it in a nice condensed form. So one component of Agent Zero is fear, but we're saying it's contagious. All right, and there's a lot of writing. Adam Smith believed in this, Gustave Le Bon. We talk about financial panics. I have a paper called Coupled Contagion Dynamics of Fear and Disease that we published that talks about this. But what's the neural basis for that? Is there some basis for fear actually being transmissible? And there's all this work on mirror neurons and other things that are interesting. Here's a related experiment that jumps off from that first one. Okay? Here's the subject we talked about before. Blue light shock, blue light shock, blue light shock. Blue light alone, that's his amygdala. It lights up. But here's the experiment where there's some other agent, Agent B, who's just observing those trials. He's not actually being shocked at all. He's just watching Flaminio be shocked. Blue light shock, blue light shock, blue light shock. Then I turn on the blue light and his amygdala recruits blood. He learns the association not through the direct experience, but through the observation of some other's experience. So I'm not sure that's exactly contagion, but again, it's akin to it. And it's a little, again, it's very useful because I don't have to get burned on the stove. I can watch Flaminio get burned and then I'm afraid of the stove, right? But I can also be afraid of another ethnic group just because Flaminio is, without any aversive experience of that other ethnic group. So it's an important mechanism in evolution, but a potentially terrible one in humans. All of this stuff is double-edged, right? So that's the emotional piece. But there's reasoning going on, even though it's a slave to the passions. Once in a while there's some reasoning, however bad it is. But we have incomplete information, imperfect information. We make terrible appraisals of what we do have. And there are a million of these wonderful experiments about framing effects, endowment effects, base rate neglect, anchoring. I love anchoring. If I read you a sequence of numbers, 2, 3, 5, 4, 6, 7, 8, and tell you, what's the product? Bark out the first number that comes to mind. And I tell another group, but I read them in the other order, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, bark out a number. The group that started with 2 will always bark out a smaller number than the group that started with 8, even though the product is, of course, the same. So the presentation, you anchor on the first number you hear, and it biases your estimate of the product, all right? So agent 0 exhibits a couple of these things, but basically, just because he's a relative frequentist, he's not a proper Bayesian, he just counts in the neighborhood orange over total yellow. That's his estimate of probability the yellow guy's a bad guy, all right? Excuse me. And they influence one another. Conformist pressures produce convergence on these counterproductive associations, and conformity effects are documented for forever. Again, is there some neuroscience about conformity? And yeah, it's quite interesting. Ethan Cross and others published a wonderful work a few years back that showed when rejection is powerfully elicited, areas that support the sensory components of physical pain become active. And he did all this fMRI work. And he put subjects in a machine, and they were people who'd been abandoned by their wife, kicked out of a group, ditched by their girlfriend, whatever it was, and they showed them a picture of the ostracizing other, and the areas that came up are the pain centers. All right, just an very interesting thing. And he says, you know, these results give new meaning to the idea that rejection hurts. Rejection and physical pain are similar, not only that they're distressing, they share a common somatosensory representation as well. So this is why we conform, because it's painful to be rejected, all right? So we give others weight, and the third ingredient of agent 0 are these weights. And I'll talk to you about those are generated inside the model, but that's a little bit of an excursion. So for the moment, let's just say they have weights. I'll tell you how they're generated. But given these components, what can we get? What does the thing do? What tricks can this thing perform? So we have the logic of the model is they form a disposition, passion and reason, they compare, and the weighted passion and reason of others. They compare that to a threshold. If it's over a threshold, they act. And that, of course, feeds back on the stimulus pattern itself, right? If they're destroying sites, they're changing the stimulus landscape. So another thing you hear is that the bottom-up models, there's not feedback from the top down, all this stuff. Of course there is, because they're changing the landscape, right? Okay. And again, I refer to all of these things as computational parables. All the code, ordinary differential equations code in Mathematica, all the ABM code in NetLogo, all the parameter values, all the initial conditions, every random seed, all of those are published on the Princeton Press Agent 0 site. So again, you can think all of it is baloney, that's fine, but it's replicable baloney, all right? That's my only claim. I think that's very important, all right? So let's put this through some paces now after all of that. Here's the picture. They're roving around. In the northeast, there's activation. The guys in the northeast destroy their sites, but so does the agent in the southwest, who's subject to no aversive stimulus at all. All right, they're just local sampling now, all right? And again, here's that movie just to refresh your memory. He goes even though he's never seen any aversive stimulus. Why? La condition humaine, this is a pun on conditioning, right? So, because his total exceeds his threshold, but he wouldn't go because his threshold exceeds his solo. So that's the ordering for him to go in the group even if he wouldn't go alone, all right? Now, the even darker and central parable, I think, in some ways, is that you know, you might be the only agent with that ordering, and in that case, despite being negatively disposed in this sense, tau is greater than your solo disposition, you go, and you go first. So he has no direct stimulus at all, but he goes first. He's not imitating anyone's behavior because there's no one to imitate, but through dispositional contagion, he develops enough fear that he wipes out his village, even though there's no bad guys there. Here's that run. Oops. Well, maybe I didn't include that run. Maybe I did. Here's the run. Okay? He goes first. That's interesting. Right? He goes first. Is he a leader? Is that leadership? It's not behavioral imitation because nobody went first. So is he a leader in any sense, or is he just the most susceptible to dispositional contagion? Is he a man of action because he's got these strong convictions? Right, he goes first not because he's leading, but because he's following the other dispositions, all right? And there's Tolstoy was the first agent-based modeler, actually. And in War and Peace, he writes, "A king is history's slave, performing for the swarm life." And it's bad etiquette to quote your own writing, but I think this is worth reading. So I write, "The overall picture of Homo sapiens reflected in these interpretations of Agent Zero is unsettling. Here we have a creature evolved, selected, for high susceptibility to unconscious fear conditioning. Fear, conscious or otherwise, can be acquired rapidly through direct exposure or indirectly through fearful others. This primal emotion is moderated by a more recently evolved deliberative module, which at best operates suboptimally on incomplete data and whose risk appraisals are normally biased further by affect itself. Both affective and cognitive modules, moreover, are powerfully influenced by the dispositions of similar, equally limited and unconsciously driven agents. Is it any wonder that collectivities of interacting agents of this type, the Agent Zero type, can exhibit mass violence, dysfunctional health behaviors, and financial panic?" So we have blow up your sites, but you can also flee. You can also have agents leave sites. And we have a lot of evacuation modeling that could be done. Katrina evacuees, Syrian evacuees, or flight from bad assets, capital flight, and so on. So here's a run in which the subject agent is in the upper right, and he would not go alone. But these other agents are very scared, and they drag him out. This is Chernobyl or some other thing. And again, I'd run this faster, but I have no controls. All right, so there's flight instead of fight. And the reverse is something called the bystander effect that was studied by Darley and Latané, that I also replicate in this way with Agent Zero. Here, the subject is sitting in a waiting room, smoke comes under the door, he leaves immediately. But if I have two confederates of the experimenter, two other fake guys in the room, the smoke comes under the door, they just keep filling out forms. The guy leaves much later, right? But it's the same smoke, so it's a social effect, all right? And Erez and I are doing quite a lot of work on this. Networks are implicated. How do network weights change? Why do networks even happen? And in the model, I try to make this an affective homophily dynamic. All right, and maybe I should move a little more quickly. Do you think? Yes. All right, so in the book there's a full description of how I do the weights, but again, they're endogenous in the model. It's basically, you know, how strong is you've got weight of agent J on agent I, how strong are our affects in the first place, and then how close are we how closely aligned are we in our affects? Strength and alignment, strength and homophily, and this produces endogenous networks. Okay. And so in this model, a lot of work using networks posits a network. We're saying networks are themselves emergent phenomena, and the network weights are proportional to the thickness of this thing. And again, this is eye candy that you could study in greater depth. But it matters a lot. So we thought, build a little toy Arab Spring, where the yellow site, these are people, general people, and the orange sites are instances of corruption, abduction, torture, theft, violations of civil liberties. And they produce tremendous grievance. You track the agent's affects, but their weights are clamped at 0 by Big Brother. There's no freedom of assembly, the internet is crushed. You can't self-organize into anything. They're in isolation, so there's no actual rebellion. And if you let them interact, then they can enforce each other's dispositions, and they start wiping out these sites. These are supposed to be jasmine colored because that was the first revolution. It was the Tunisian one. It didn't come out very jasmine. But in any event, you get the idea. When they're allowed to interact, then they can overthrow the regime, right? So it's revolt of the swarm. And I think what's interesting is that a lot of, these are leaderless revolutions. And I think a lot of what's going on in revolutions these days is leaderless. I mean, you can't name the leader of the Arab Spring or the leader of the Hong Kong insurgency or these other things. I mean, they're enabled by this. And so are results in fields like jury trials and so on. Again, I'm not going to go through this in detail, except to say that everyone alone would acquit the accused in this picture, but together they unanimously convict, right? So it's universal self-betrayal, right? Everybody's solo disposition is sub-threshold, but when they're sequestered in the jury room and can interact with one another, then they all convict. So no jurors would have convicted before that phase, but they're unanimous in a guilty verdict when they interact directly. Again, these are results that I think are, important parables of the human condition. Then there's work in the book on why networks happen. All right, and I'm not going to go through all of this, except to say that links can form and break, and there's a dynamics of network structure in its own right. And that's apart from the literature on networks. Barabasi and Albert published their great article on preferential attachment, which actually has a long mathematical history. And here, attachment is not a function of the size of the network component. It's attachment by homophily, and it's degree independent. I mean, you go to the subnetwork with, with the largest subcomponent. And here it has nothing to do with the size of the network. All right, so again, this is just a point, but it's testable, right? You can study networks this way. Several final points about extensions. Julia Chellan and I published a chapter in a book by Alan Kerman and David Wilson, where we looked at a lot of different ways to do Agent Zero, different emotional, deliberative, and so modules, and several application areas. One obvious thing to do is scale the thing up. As I say, that's 3 agents. I've done a lot of this since the book was published. And populate larger models with them. I'm also working hard on a variant that I call Addict Zero, where instead of the affective module, you have some mathematical models of the neurobiology of addiction. So it's not an affective module, it's a neurobiological addiction module that again can compete with your deliberations, right? And with social forces, right? You might say, I really, I know it's bad to be, shooting heroin. And early on in your experimentation, an intervention might matter a lot, or your own reasoning might say, this is clearly nuts, But at a certain point, the neurobiology can take over and trump all of that. And so I'm building an Addict Zero variant in which you get that kind of dynamics for opioids, alcohol, tobacco. It's probably a substantial line of thought. Try to grow the opioid epidemic, right? Calibrate it to US data. You can have very colorful, beautiful maps of opioid abuse in space and time. So grow that movie, all right? Inverse generative social science, to your point, there are many ways to generate it. So how do we get the entire population of agent models that will generate the phenomenon? And we're doing quite a lot of work with, I call this inverse generative social science. You're saying, here's the output. What's the entire family of agent-based models? The entire breed of Agent Zero-like creatures that could generate that. And we're using a lot of evolutionary programming and have a paper in GECO on inverse generative social science for alcohol abuse in the UK. So this is a whole move that I think could be quite important for our field. Instead of handcrafting the agents through, creativity and inspiration and what have you, you could start with the output. And instead of implementing an agent, you just give the evolutionary program operators and permissible concatenations, and it generates trees, which are actually agents. It's a whole other idea that I'm playing around with. Okay, so summary of the talk, don't be intimidated, lots of goals for modeling, and modeling at scales from every possible level are possible, right? You can, the world is your oyster. You can do all kinds of modeling for all kinds of reasoning, all right? The agent-based model is the principal scientific instrument of generative social science, and Agent Zero is one foundation for that. All right, so I'm very excited about your school. Please consider me a colleague, and thank you very much. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Josh,
Sure.
for this brilliant talk. And are any questions from you guys?
Please.
Oh, pardon.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could comment, I know it's going to be very brief, on what happened with the Google flu fiasco.
I'm not sure I know what it was. Tell me what the fiasco was.
Oh,
I thought it was great that they were beating the CDC in their projections of flu.
but they didn't. It just went completely pear-shaped.
Did it? I don't know. I
Yeah,
really
okay,
haven't
so,
followed.
yeah, that became a huge sort of, because what they were using was they were using Google searches
Yeah,
to
yeah.
do this, and they said, well, okay, we're going to model this, and we know where the flu outbreaks are going to be. And it turned out what happened was that people would make these searches just because they were interested, you know, in what was going on.
Ah.
They had heard about this,
Right.
or that's, oh, I have allergies. I'll just search what happens if I
Right,
have
right,
sniffly noses. And I mean, so this is always one of these, like, as a dyed-in-the-wool qualitative researcher, I, you know, always challenged by is how do we know that, you know, I mean, you've, you know, very clearly outlined a lot of good reasons why we model that aren't predictive. But how do we know we don't have garbage in, garbage out when we have this kind of modeling based on empirical data?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I mean, I think that's a great question. I just don't. I'm not familiar with the whole episode. We didn't use Google. We used CDC data and NIH data, and just didn't go that way. So I don't. I mean, that particular episode, I don't know. I think the general question of garbage in, garbage out is interesting. And I actually think sometimes, I mean, I think obviously there are cases where garbage in produces garbage out. But I also think that adage should also, I think, you know, it depends what I want out, okay? I mean, for example, if I just care about where the ball ends up, I start the ball, you know, anywhere in the bowl. I started here, it still goes here. I started here, it goes here. If all I care about is where the thing ends up, I don't care if my initial measurements are garbage. They can all be garbage, but I still know that the equilibrium will be here. So if all I care about is the final state of the ball, I'm fine with garbage in. So again, but obviously if I care about an empirical situation, I may not be happy with garbage in. So whether garbage in or garbage out is actually an appropriate adage, I think does depend on the, I know this is a little bit impertinent response to your very good question, but if I'm permitted, I think when we think about this garbage in, garbage out thing, you need to be careful about what's the out. And it may be that for some kinds of outputs, you really, garbage in is fine.
Anyone else? A colleague of mine, who also loves ABMs, by the way, he always says that ABMs can illustrate something or they can provide an argument maybe, but they are never evidence in the narrow sense, and I would be interested in whether you would subscribe to that.
I'm not sure what that. I'm not sure what he means by that, actually. I mean, or she. When you say they don't provide evidence, I mean, if I have some behavior in the world, it's segregation, and I have rules for the agents that generate the observed pattern of segregation, why isn't that evidence in the support of a? I mean, evidence for what? I would say, if for what? Evidence for X. If X is here are rules that generate the observed macro pattern, then the agent-based model is perhaps the only source of evidence.
Right, but then you have the data out there in the world that
Right.
you can observe and you can compare it to your model.
Exactly.
But then the observed data out there that matches up with your ABM is the evidence.
Okay.
And the ABM without that can probably provide
No, but I'm
a
sorry.
guideline or something.
No, I don't
you
think
know.
the data out there is evidence of a micromechanism at all. It's just a target. What is it evidence of? If it's just the data, what's it evidence of?
Anyone else? So, thank you again, Josh.
Okay, there's another talk on that?
Yeah,
Please,
yeah. So thank you very much for your talk. It's related with the question those before. So if we have some state of the world, something that we want to explain, let's say the segregation, and but we can
build
multiple plausible models
Right.
to explain this the observed data, right?
Right.
So how can we say that we got the mechanism, not some A mechanism?
Yeah. I think we have to be very careful in saying that we have the mechanism. I wouldn't generally say that. I would say that it's a mechanism, and until there are alternatives, as in physics or any other science, I'm going with the one I have. If there are several, then I need to construct experiments or take data that will allow me to discriminate which of those is the more realistic. But I mean, that's the situation in any science where you have competing hypotheses. You have competing agent-based models, both of which explain the data, both of which generate the data, and now you say, well, which is better? I need to design an experiment or collect new data that will permit me to discriminate. No? That may be very hard to do, it may take a long time to do, but I don't think it poses a particularly novel problem in principle. Please.
I'm wondering in general, how do you balance cognitive control with complexity?
The which, I'm sorry?
Cognitive control
Yeah.
with complexity of the model.
Well, again, I think what's complex is the dynamics. So I think that when you say complexity of the model, I'm not sure I think the model can be very simple and capture the complexity of the actual world and the interactions and the evolution of things. So I don't think the model needs to be complex.
What about if there are a lot of dynamics included?
Right, right. Well, are they included or are they generated by the rules?
Included, like you put a lot of mechanisms?
Then I think it's I think when you put the more mechanisms you have in the agents themselves, the harder it is to understand what's going on. I mean, I think the danger with agent-based modeling is that it's very easy to put in tons of stuff. And I don't know, you've had this experience, I'm sure. When people say, well, why don't you put in this? Why don't you put in that? You can put in everything. And that's one of the dangers of things like NetLogo, right? You can immediately do all of that. So I just try to resist the temptation to add anything that can be kept out. But maybe I'm not answering your question, I'm not sure.
This is what I was wondering at. That sometimes when you want to describe a phenomenon, and this phenomenon has a lot of factors,
Yeah.
and you
Right.
really want to...
Absolutely. No, it's Einstein's adage, right? You build the model as simple as possible, but no simpler. And sometimes you have to include a lot of detail, a lot of complexity, many mechanisms, and so on. So I think it's just a question of, try to find the simplest thing that captures what's really essential. But sometimes the simplest thing is still complicated. I agree.
Kitchen sink foundation.
Yeah, right. Right. Yeah, right, exactly.
Hang on. So, thank you again. John.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
I suggest that we shift all the program 30 minutes. So now we have a coffee break, second floor, and we'll be back at 12. Okay? For the second lecture. Okay?
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
very much.
Thank you. No, Mike. Please, thank you. On it. Thank you. Thank you.